The Helen Suzman Foundation has argued that it's not asking the Gauteng High Court in Pretoria to make a finding that guarantees the existence of the Zimbabwean Exemption Permit forever. The foundation is challenging the decision of Home Affairs Minister Dr. Motsoaledi to terminate the ZEP before a full High Court bench. If the minister is successful, at least 178,000 permit holders and their children will be left with the choice of returning to Zimbabwe or remaining in South Africa as undocumented migrants. Now, the foundation is seeking a declaration that the minister's decision is unconstitutional, unlawful and invalid and should be set aside. Should it be set aside, the foundation further asks that the decision to terminate the ZEP be sent back to the minister to consider afresh following a proper and procedurally fair process. Advocate Stephen Bandlender, SC, is on behalf of the foundation and elaborates further.
My client does not suggest and does not ask this court to find that the minister may never terminate the ZEP program. That is not my client's case, and that is not the submission I make. But my client does say, and I do submit, that because any termination has such profound consequences, in order to be valid, it must firstly follow a fair and procedurally rational consultation process. Secondly, be consistent with fundamental constitutional rights enshrined in our Constitution. And thirdly, be based on lawful, rational, and reasonable ground.
Right, so for more on this, we're joined by our politics reporter, Canny Maphanga. Canny, good afternoon. Thank you for joining us.
Good afternoon.
You've been following the case today. We've obviously seen that 13 years ago, this was put into place to regularize the status of many Zimbabweans in the country. Perhaps you can give us some context and background to how we ended up here today in court.
Well, of course, the ZEP stems from the violence in 2008, and you saw a large influx of Zimbabweans coming into the country. The South African government then saw this opportunity to bring in what we term the ZEP program, which would then give documentation to ZEP holders as well as their children to stay, work, attend school in South Africa. I think about 180,000 of those ZEP holders are currently still holding that permit. But of course, the climate has changed. It was supposed to be a temporary document. It's not a mainstream visa of any kind, but it is a legal document. And it is a manner in which you can trace those citizens that are using that permit. But of course, in the climate that we're dealing with now, within the recent years, if I can put it that way, you've seen the rise or emergence of anti-migrant groups, the attacks on migrants, this issue, broader issue of illegal migration, the pressure to address this issue in the country. The ANC then comes up with this migration policy framework, which is aimed at tightening those migration laws in the country. And then, of course, you see this sudden decision. When I say sudden, I mean that it wasn't followed by representations or consultation prior to the decision, that this temporary document, even though it's been 14 years, is now going to be terminated as of 30th June 2023. So the Helen Suzman Foundation, as well as two other applicants, are now in courts challenging that decision by the minister.
Perhaps you could take us through some of those, the applicants' main arguments, the merits of the case, etc.
Okay, so this case is going to sit for 4 days in this virtual court before a full bench. The Helen Suzman Foundation is up first. They are challenging that decision first. And I think it's important for people to understand that the argument of the Helen Suzman Foundation, rather, is not that this permit must exist forever or that the court must now intervene and change the decision of a minister. No, the argument is that if such a decision is supposed to be made and the consequences that will follow from that decision, remember you're speaking of people that have been in this country for over a decade, have built a life here, and is it justifiable to say that those people must now return to their homeland without considering the impact, without considering representations or consultation and all of those legal steps to make that decision constitutionally valid. So the argument is not that they want the ZEP to stay, but rather that a proper, fair, constitutionally valid process must follow in order for that decision to be valid. And of course, people will say the ZEP was always supposed to be temporary. There's alternative visas that ZEP holders can seek. However, we know the barriers to obtaining visas in this country, especially if you are a ZEP holder and you're not obtaining those critical skills. Visas are also quite pricey, so it's not an easy process to deal with. And on top of that, the Home Affairs Department is still dealing with a significant backlog in issuing out those visas. So even if that alternative was there, the Helen Suzman Foundation is arguing that in 3 months, it's unlikely that a ZEP holder would be able to obtain those alternative mainstream visas. On top of that, the 4,000 out of the 180,000 that applied for those waivers to date, we don't have figures from the Home Affairs Department as to how many were approved, how many were rejected, what happened to those 4,000 applications.
People are, speaking about whether this is an issue of illegal immigration. There are also questions about whether they are political lambs for slaughter. How would you weigh in on some of those sentiments that have been echoed whilst this case unfolds?
I don't think it would be accurate to call this a case of illegal migration because ZEP holders are documented. And if you look at the 180,000 that were holding that permit, that is a very small fraction in comparison to the number of undocumented migrants that are living in the country. If you just only zoom it in on Zimbabwean nationals, it's an even smaller fraction in comparison to that. So I think the confusion comes from if the intention is to address illegal migration, why would you take a process where the nationals are documented and then pile it onto a system that is already exacerbated by the number of applications and the backlogs that they're dealing with? You already have a system where these people are documented and traceable, and you're moving them to a pile where they will now become undocumented migrants if they do not return back to Zimbabwe.
Canny, thank you for your time here with us, giving us the update. You said the case unfolds for the next 4 days, so we'll continue to monitor and see what unfolds there. If South Africa does terminate the permits at the end of June 2023, it will affect roughly 180,000 Zimbabweans living in South Africa.